You're listening to the MindPod Network. Friends, lovers, and listeners, you can always support this podcast by heading over to iTunes and leaving this podcast a review or just give it a rating. That's always a great way to support It's All Happening. And of course, you could go to zachleary.com and use the Amazon portal to buy all of your stuff. It's all happening. 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 Hello, friends. Welcome to the podcast. This is episode 133 of the It's All Happening with Zach Leary podcast. That's me. I'm your host. And on this episode of the podcast, we have the legendary, the iconic Dr. Andrew Weil. Wow, what can I say? The children are very, very excited on this episode of the show. Not just about the show, but also about the guest. And this interview was recorded for the MAPS podcast specifically, and it deals with psychedelic medicines because it was recorded for the MAPS podcast. But it was so good and fruitful and lively and engaging, and I really enjoyed my time with Dr. Weil that I had to reuse it for the It's All Happening show. It just made sense. And I'm pretty sure most of you know who Dr. Andrew Weil is, but he is a world-renowned leader and pioneer in the field of integrative medicine, which he defines as a healing-oriented approach to healthcare, which encompasses body, mind, and spirit. And, you know, I've always had the perspective that Dr. Weil has led that discussion and held a place in our culture by positioning his expertise in integrative medicine as a preventive medicine technique, by encouraging self-care and wellness through diet, nutrition, supplements, and all sorts of methods that the mainstream medical community may call alternative. But that aside, and he's been around for decades and decades, and was a graduate student at Harvard University with none other than Richard Albert and Timothy Leary. Yes, very interesting. So he's known and been a part of the greater psychedelic conversation for quite a while. However, before the podcast begins, there's something on my mind. Now, I don't know about you guys, I know there's always been a lot of great stories being told out there about outrageous things that are just, too hard to believe, stranger than fiction, that the truth is you can't make this stuff up, right? Those kinds of things. But lately, shit has gotten really weird, really dysfunctional, really perverse, and really twisted, and entering some strange spaces where cognitive dissonance and reality distortion fields are the norm. Specifically, what am I talking about? The Fire documentary about the music festival, Fire, F-Y-R-E. The Inventor, Out for Blood in Silicon Valley, the story of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, her company. Wild Wild Country, about the famous, now infamous, ranch of Osho devotees in Oregon. And finally, Leaving Neverland, the story of Michael Jackson's sexual abuse revolving around two specific people, right? Man, I could talk about each one of these documentaries for hours and hours and hours, but each one of them shares this common thread, and it's almost hard to explain, but it's like this thread of cognitive dissonance within the believers, like the people that surround the main like messianic demagoguery type of figure that is the center of their universe, Michael Jackson or Elizabeth Holmes, Osho. And they orbit around that sun so closely with such blind devotion that reality doesn't matter. It literally doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is their belief system that is an amalgamation of idealism, the need to believe, perhaps a mission, and so many other things that make that up, right? But what I find so fascinating about the Elizabeth Holmes story specifically is that it is a product of Silicon Valley, right? And within Silicon Valley, anybody who works there, especially in the startup environment, they are praying that the startup they're working for is going to be the next juggernaut, is going to be the next Facebook, Google, Uber, whatever, right? That, those corporate cultures there, the belief systems become so mesmerized in idealism and, the possible opportunity for creating the next juggernaut, that it gets wrapped up into these cults of personalities that have no basis in reality whatsoever. And I think after watching all of these documentaries and reading all this stuff, I think that's the only thing that really interested Elizabeth Holmes. She didn't surround herself with the greatest minds in the world who were experts at, in medical devices and healthcare and all the intricacies that go along with changing that. She, just had this idea and this mission that was very, very appealing, but that was based in deception and created this ability for her to rise above the truth and just become a caricature of everything that she wanted to be, right? It's really, really fascinating stuff, and it makes me think a lot about the things I believe in, what I don't believe in, what I follow blindly, what I need to research more, how my preconceived attitudes automatically get me to think something, automatically get me to a certain result without even, doing the research, right? Really interesting stuff. Watch these films and let me know what you think. All right, we're going to get into the podcast with Dr. Andrew Weil. And as I mentioned earlier, this interview was recorded for the MAPS podcast, but it was so good that I had to use it for It's All Happening, of course. And if you listen to both shows, sorry about that, but thank you for listening to both. And if you don't, I really hope you enjoy the interview. And, a reminder, yes, the Integrative Mental Health Conference is taking place April 15th through the 17th in San Francisco. And that conference is the impetus for how this interview got set up and all of that. So check it out. I really hope you enjoy it. Dr. Andrew Weil. Dr. Andrew Weil, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining the MAPS podcast. It is a pleasure to be speaking with you. I've been wanting to do this one for quite a long time. And who would have thought that 2019 is such an amazing time to be talking about psychedelics, right?
It's just wonderful to me to see this resurgence of interest. I have always felt that there's a tremendous potential for these drugs in medicine, and not just for emotional psychiatric conditions, but for physical ones as well, because I've seen remarkable change disease and cures of longstanding disease problems as a result of psychedelic experience. And I hope as they become available for therapeutic use that people will begin to explore that.
Yeah, it's an amazing thing that you just touched on. You have seen the rise, the subsequent fall, and the rise again of the second psychedelic renaissance. What do you think attributed the first, or how about, I'm going to phrase it this way. What do you think we can attribute the second renaissance of psychedelic research in medicine to? Because, for a long time, even I thought this is going to stay underground. I'm not really sure it's going to see the light of day in a serious research data-based context. And all of a sudden, here we are. What happened?
Well, I have to say that I attribute a lot of that to the efforts of MAPS.
Yes.
And MAPS have done a tremendous job of organizing, furthering research on the positive potentials of psychedelics. So that goes back for some time. And as a result of that and the research findings there began to be increasing number of articles, interestingly enough, I think mostly in women's magazines, that spoke of the positive therapeutic potential of MDMA, of mushrooms, of LSD. So I think there was a building groundswell of positive publicity about them. More researchers got into it with the intention of documenting their positive effects. And then suddenly, I think there was the discovery by people in Silicon Valley of psychedelics and microdosing, and now it seems to be really becoming mainstream. I see characters on mainstream TV dramas microdosing.
It's an amazing thing. I mean, the cultural shift. Maybe it took the hysteria or the cliche of the 60s to sort of die down, and for it to kind of resurface back in these circles that you're talking about, huh?
Another factor, Zach, I think, is that the reporting of positive effects in returning veterans with PTSD and other serious conditions for which conventional medicine really has no great answers. Right.
So that being said, what do you think? I mean, you just talked about PTSD. What else is really of interest to you in terms of the latest research that we're seeing?
Well, certainly for psychological problems such as depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, PTSD, anxiety disorders, I think great potential there. But as I said to you, I think that tremendous usefulness in managing autoimmune conditions, in cancer, in many chronic conditions. My experience has been that experiences on psychedelics can show you or give you glimpses of the possibility of experiencing what's going on in your body in different ways. And seeing those possibilities can then motivate you to find other ways of maintaining those experiences.
That is a fascinating thing that you just said, seeing your body in different ways. So let's take an example like cancer, just for example. I mean, we can use any model, but cancer is a good one. And cancer becoming also seemingly a lot more, apparent within the general population. If psychedelics plays a role in seeing your body in a different way, talk to me a little bit about your philosophy and your approach to a holistic view of treating something like cancer that includes psychedelics and diet and other things.
That complicated question. So
okay.
First, I think some of the earliest research with LSD was done at Spring Grove State Hospital in Maryland, a psychiatric hospital, by Walter Pankey and Stan Groff. And there were they were guided LSD sessions with terminal cancer patients. They were prepared for the experience, then had a guided session, and then follow-up therapy. Now, this was not with the intention of treating cancer. It was to help patients come to terms with the fact that they were close to death. But the findings were very positive. People had less pain. They required less pain medication. They became much more comfortable with their approaching death. They were able to spend productive time with family. That was a good thing. But I think I also would say that I have seen a couple of dramatic cases of remission of cancer that seem to have been initiated by psychedelic experience. I don't know how often that can happen or how great a possibility that is. But I certainly think that a psychedelic experience could be part of helping people manage chronic pain or other symptoms of cancer. As an aside, let me just say, a few years ago, I was in Beijing, and I was touring a hospital called Guang'an Hospital, a huge modern hospital. If you walk into it, you think you're in a Western hospital. The whole hospital was devoted to integrative medicine, and the largest department was oncology. And every cancer patient there gets chemotherapy, radiation, surgery as indicated, but also gets very sophisticated nutritional therapy, very sophisticated herbal therapy designed to reduce the toxicity of standard treatments, increase their efficacy, reduce risk of recurrence, and improve quality of life. I saw great outcomes there. It made me very sad that so few cancer patients here can access that kind of care.
And the reason for that being, I know that is also a very complicated question, why we can't receive that kind of care in America, but the gist of it being what? That
not enough oncologists are trained in integrative medicine. There is now a society for integrative oncology, but the demand for this is huge, and the numbers of providers who can give that kind of treatment is very, very limited at the moment.
So if you are seeing your body in a different way, and also easing your anxiety around death and dying, and if you happen to find yourself in a situation like this, how does that change the relationship to the disease? Like, I'm just trying to go with the intuition here. Like, if you have less anxiety around, what's going on within your body, the disease, to me, that feels like you are more at ease. You're more sort of at peace with what's naturally occurring. And that has positive effects for the actual, I guess, the physiology, the actual chemistry behind the disease then.
Right. But let me say cancer is not the best example to take because that's difficult.
Yeah, sure, of course.
When you look at conditions like allergy, autoimmunity, chronic pain, you can see very dramatic changes as a result of changes in the way you think about that disease process during a psychedelic experience. I've given accounts of complete disappearance of lifelong allergies with one psychedelic session, disappearance of chronic pain, remission of rheumatoid arthritis. And I think some of this, it just comes from shifting into a different mental state, maybe running different software through the system. And the result in the body is very dramatic.
The shifting of software in the system and all of these different, ailments or maladies that may arise in the human condition. Is the average, I guess, Western human in modern society experiencing more possible ailments than they did, say, 50 years ago? I feel like there's more. There's, I think, more options of what could go wrong. I know health and wellness and life expectancy is going up, but there seems to be more of an option for like a pill for everything, and that's sort of creating an attitude of like, oh my gosh, maybe I have this, I don't know.
There's been a tremendous rise in allergy and autoimmunity. Did you know, for example, hay fever was unknown before about 1880.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It first appeared in England. A number of autoimmune diseases also. And some of these seem to be a result of living in too clean environments. There's the whole hygiene hypothesis that says that exposure to dirt and germs early in life helps the immune system become strong, and that by keeping things too clean, we interfere with that learning process. So it's possible that some of these diseases of civilization are fairly recent. I've spent time with hunter-gatherer peoples in Africa and South America, and our is autoimmune disease. So these are diseases of civilization.
Wow, that is fascinating. So, the life in the modern world and increasingly in urban environments, more people shifting to urban environments are creating these new disorders like that. I mean, I know this is a sort of a general question, but as far as preventative medicine goes, what's the best approach for avoiding things like this?
I think living in as close to a natural environment as possible, spending time in nature, eating whole foods, getting good physical activity, good rest and sleep, sleeping in darkness. I mean, also, if you look at the lifestyles of people in pre-modern society, also, I think a recent phenomenon that disturbs me is our dependence on devices.
I just was going to ask that, our relationship with technology.
Yeah, I think it is dramatically changing brain function. It's decreasing attention span. I think it's increasing anxiety and depression. I think it's really changing the way we experience the world. And we haven't seen anything yet. This is going to continue.
Yeah, I mean, this is still a brand new. It hasn't even affected an entire generation from start to finish yet. I know we're drifting away from psychedelics a little bit, but that's okay. What's your relationship to technology on a personal level? I mean, how do you find the balance and equanimity in it?
I try to limit my screen time. I stop in mid-afternoon. I try not to look at the computer. Really don't use my cell phone all that much. But it's difficult. It's just, it really invades your life. And also you said we're drifting away from psychedelics, but I think it's been psychedelic experiences for me in nature.
Yes.
That make me realize that that's how I want to be at more of the time, and not in this world of screens and texts and beeps and so forth.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, psychedelics have done a lot for me personally around that idea. But what I find so fascinating and under psychedelics too is that I do remember a life before so much screen time, yet we adapted so quickly. We morphed into the attachment so quickly, and that's a puzzling thing for me to try to figure out. How did that happen so fast?
Yes, and I think, and going back to what we were talking about earlier about changing your experience of disease, I think many people who have chronic disease or anything that happens to you, the natural reaction is to try to defend yourself against it and to fight what's going on in your body. And I think my experience is that mental stance, that defensive fighting posture, actually strengthens and prolongs many disease processes. And in a psychedelic state, you are often able to drop that defensive posture. And when you do, if you accept, somehow it moderates it and softens it and gives you the possibility of changing it.
Right. That's a very, all around, that's a very Western paradigm, even if you go all the way to, our ideas around death and dying. I mean, there is so much resistance and just fighting, extend life, forgetting quality of life, just hang on without moving into the idea of surrender and just accept what's happening. Whatever is happening is happening.
Exactly.
And the Eastern modality is so much different. So within the medical community of which, you are part of, at this point, where do you see psychedelics today in 2019? What's the role of psychedelics within the medical community?
There's a lot of interest, more than I've ever seen among my colleagues, both older and younger. But the fact that all of these drugs are Schedule 1 controlled substances means that they're not available for therapeutic use. So most doctors shy away from them. And another problem is that when you look at the positive results in research of psychedelic experiences, I think it's very dependent on the mindset of the experimenter. And one of the problems that happened in the late 60s and early 70s that turned people off of research in this area is that many researchers were unable to replicate the results of these early positive studies because they themselves didn't have experience of the substances and didn't really know how to drug. It's in the drug set and setting. And unless people know how to manage set and setting, you don't realize the positive potential. So I think that's a critical factor that if doctors are going to use these things or be able to use them, they themselves have to be very experienced in them.
That is a very different, compared to other mental health prescribed medications, that's a very, very different relationship, right? Because you can't say that all doctors have a relationship with, right.
Well, my mentor and colleague, late Norman Zinberg, with whom I did the first double-blind controlled studies of cannabis, he was a psychoanalyst, and he directed the psychiatric residency program at Cambridge Hospital in Boston, one of the Harvard hospitals, and he required that all program take one dose of all of the medications that they gave to patients. And as a result of that, there was less prescribing in that hospital than in other psychiatric hospitals.
That's fantastic. And you were talking a little bit about set and setting before. I'd love to hear your take on what set and setting is and how that works.
Set is a term for a person's expectations of what a drug or other intervention will do, and often those expectations are unconscious and not easy to not easily revealed or understood. So it's a complex set of factors. Setting refers to the environment in which a drug is taken, both the physical environment and social environment. And it is totally clear to me, and by the way, this is something that your father was one of the first people to really emphasize, is that drug reactions are the result of the interaction of the drug, including the dose and the nature of the drug, set and setting. And the influence of set and setting can completely control, direct, and even reverse the pharmacological action of the drug. You can give a dose of a sedative drug to subjects in conditions of set and setting where they will become stimulated. And you can give a dose of a stimulant drug to a person with manipulation of set and setting with the result that they will become sedated. So it can even reverse pharmacological action. And you cannot understand drug experiences without seeing it as a complex interaction of those three factors: drug, set, and setting.
In the setting part of this, who do you think is who's not a good candidate for psychedelic use? What makes somebody potentially, maybe this isn't for you? What do you think?
I'm sorry, part of that cut out. Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, under the setting part of set and setting. If you are looking at a patient who is considering going down the road of psychedelic medicine for whatever application, mental health, physical, or just inspirational, who is not a good candidate for psychedelic use? What makes somebody potentially not ready for this type of experience?
Very good question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. I would say if you see a person who's terrified of losing their mind, if that's a very strong fear, I think they would have to be prepared very carefully for psychedelic experience. Someone who's had a past history of severe anxiety, I think would have to be prepared very carefully.
Right, and they potentially might not be a good candidate at all. Let's talk a little bit about guided psychedelic therapy, if you're comfortable talking about that. what makes somebody a good guide? What should somebody look for when searching for a guide?
I think, first of all, their experience and also their motives in being a guide, because I see a number of people for whom I think guiding is kind of an ego trip. And that's not the best kind of person to place yourself, in their hands. I think you want to know how much experience the person has with the substance, how many guided trips they've done, what their training is, all of that.
Right. That's all fair enough for sure.
Right now, exactly. There's people interested in ayahuasca, and you can find ayahuasca sessions offered, seems, on every street corner at the moment, something that I would never believe possible when I was studying it in South America. But, I've had people come to me saying that, I want to do an ayahuasca trip, and there's this, leaflet saying these people are offering it. And I advise people to be just very careful about that, to check out very thoroughly the credentials, training of the person who's the guide, and to spend some time with them before you actually do the ceremony.
Yeah, and one of the I'm not passing judgment or anything like that, but we are seeing a lot more, I guess, so-called shamans arise and kind of come out of the woodwork. People who are calling themselves shamans, and I see it here in Southern California all the time. It's like, oh my gosh, this is the new shaman doing an ayahuasca circle, and it's hard to know where to go, who to trust, right? And of course, that's would be one of the great benefits of, rescheduling these plants and medicines, because we could have resources online to guide people. But that's something I wanted to ask, and I know it's sensitive around many medical professionals, but because of the legal situation that most psychedelics still find themselves in, where does somebody start? Like, where can they look for accurate information?
Well, again, I would direct people to MAPS, which I think is an excellent resource. I would say there's going to be a push to make MDMA available for therapeutic use, maybe first because of all of the positive potential there for treating PTSD, especially. I think that next we might see some momentum toward legalization of psilocybin, maybe ibogaine for the treatment of addictions. I think this is coming, and I understand Oregon is considering an initiative to legalize psilocybin. So maybe we'll start to see these things happen. In general, with the scheduling of drugs, they never go from tougher schedules to lighter schedules. When things move into Schedule 1, they never get out. But I think we're going to see this happen. Obviously, it's going to happen with cannabis at some point. Yep. And I think it'll happen with the psychedelics as well, as a result of the change in consciousness that is happening in our culture.
Yeah, it seems like cannabis is leading the way, and I know somebody in the House just put forth a bill on the federal level to change the scheduling of cannabis on a federal level. Probably won't. It'll get shot down in the Senate in this administration, but it's interesting to see that hey, at least the discussion is being had. We spent. When
I did my marijuana studies, that was in 1968. I naively thought that marijuana would be legal in 5 years. I thought it was just a matter of getting the right information out there, and I quickly learned that was not the case, that people believe what they want to believe, and it's very hard to change minds. But certainly we are seeing a change happening. I think it's inevitable that cannabis will be out of Schedule 1. And actually, I think the push for psychedelics is going to come fast. Another one I didn't mention is, I think, the psilocybin for the treatment of depression. I think there's going to be a lot of momentum behind that.
Psilocybin in the treatment of depression. How does that work from a mental health perspective? I've had my own experiences around depression and psilocybin therapy, but I still find it kind of difficult to explain because the shift in perspective is very powerful. But as a medical professional, how can you sort of define the potential in that?
I'm not sure. I'm not an expert in that area, and I don't know how much of the positive effects are due to pharmacological action in the brain and how much to, a psychological effect that's conditioned by set and setting. There have been research papers published on this and increasing documentation of positive effect there. So, but what the mechanism is, I don't know.
Okay. And with psilocybin specifically, is there anything dangerous about psilocybin? I mean, I know with like MDMA, for instance, MDMA is a highly synthesized compound. Dosage is very, very important, not just for the experience, but also for the safety of the body and so on and so forth. But with psilocybin and the natural plant medicines, I do want to be objective a little bit and talk about any potential risks.
As you know, there are two broad families of psychedelics. There are the smaller one are the phenethylamines, or sometimes called substituted amphetamines, that include mescaline and MDMA, a few others. The larger one are the indoles, which are related to DMT that's made in the pineal gland in the human brain. The phenethylamines are all stimulants, more so than the indoles, and there is a somewhat higher potential for toxicity there, of blood pressure and heart arrhythmias and so forth, although still I think they're quite safe drugs. But the indoles are remarkable for their complete absence of toxicity. I mean, you can't kill anyone with psychedelics, so on a purely pharmacological, physiological level, they're safer than any drugs we use in medicine. And I think the main risks are psychological, and those are totally the result of set and setting. So, and as well as dose. So if a proper dose is given with proper attention to set and setting, I think the risks associated with these drugs are very small.
And I want to talk a little bit about preparation for a second, because I really do consider you to be one of the world's foremost experts on integrative medicine and diet, nutrition, and exercise, and supplements and herbs. Do you have an opinion on what an ideal preparation ritual or routine is for taking a psychedelic journey?
I think it'd be good to have some sort of ritual that fits you personally. In the ayahuasca world, among ayahuasqueros in South America, there are often fairly rigid rules for preparing for the ceremony: avoidance of alcohol, meat, for example, abstaining from sex for a certain period before taking the drug. And probably all that is useful as a way of standardizing and adjusting set and setting to reduce the risk of a bad trip. I don't know. I think advice of that sort has to be very much individualized. And this is part of the art of being a guide, of being able to assess the belief system of a person as well as their physical state and give them specific advice about preparing. I certainly believe it is good to prepare in some way, both on the mental level, physical level, and not just take a psychedelic on a whim.
Absolutely. I wanted to go back to talk about addiction for a second, because we did talk a little bit about ibogaine. You mentioned it, addiction being one of the the most fertile places for groundbreaking work with psychedelics. And since doing this podcast, I get a lot of communication, people asking about addiction potentials, therapies, places to go. But I also get a lot of emails kind of expressing the contradiction in it and not really understanding that. Being able to treat addiction to one substance with another substance. So how does that work? Let's talk a little bit about that. We can use ibogaine or anything else, but where do these substances play a role in addiction?
Also a complicated question. First of all, I don't have firsthand experience with ibogaine, and I have no idea how it might work. But my understanding of addiction is this. First of all, I think addiction is a universal problem, something that we all deal with. And the only reason we don't see how universal it is that some addictions are acceptable, such as addiction to exercise or addiction to power or addiction to knowledge or addiction to thinking. But I think we all wrestle with that. We all tend to get stuck on things, on external things to make us feel all right. And drugs are just one special case of that. And my understanding also, I think addiction is a very tough to deal with. And I see only really two ways of dealing it. One is to shift addictive behavior towards activities and things that are less harmful rather than more harmful. It is better to be addicted to running than to smoking cigarettes, for example.
Sure.
It's okay. But I've seen addicted runners who get into tremendous problems, both physical and mental. At any rate, that's an example of shifting to a less harmful addiction. I think to get to the root of addiction, my sense is that Buddhist psychology has the most to say about that. I think the root of addiction is a tendency to get attached to external things, to believe, to become under the illusion that the experience of completion, happiness, satisfaction comes from the external world. And I think the only way of dealing with that is by really restructuring the mind and coming to discover that everything you want is really inside you. And I think when you discover that, you are free. Another, I think you'll find this in the medical literature, is that even with the hardest forms of drug addiction, such as cigarette addiction, which I put right up there, is right at the top, or heroin addiction, you see that with a cigarette addict, they may have tried again and again to quit. And they talk about what a struggle it is, how horrible, and they go back. But one day they wake up, and it's some little thing like looking at stained fingers or a dirty ashtray, and suddenly they don't want to do it anymore. And that time, it's no struggle, and that's the end of it. And I've seen that with heroin addicts, with people who are alcoholics, with addicted smokers. So and that has to do with motivation. And the problem is you can't put motivation into someone else. So until motivation reaches a certain level, it is tough or impossible to break addictive behavior. I tell smokers that just make an attempt to quit, set a date and make an attempt. It doesn't matter if you succeed, because each time you try, the reservoir of motivation becomes fuller. And one day it'll be full enough that it'll make it easy.
Right. You have to hit your own bottom and have an awareness of your own bottom that's, severe enough for you to where you finally say, hey, that's enough, right?
Right.
But like you explained earlier in that answering that question about the human condition possibly having defaulting to many forms of addiction beyond substance abuse or anything like that. And the Buddhist philosophical approach about, needing external things to fix you. But I want to talk about that a little bit more, because I think the rise of addiction, especially in America, I haven't really studied the global statistics, but we're seeing the opioid crisis at an all-time high here in America, and other OCD conditions that may be labeled as addiction really taking hold in food or sex, gambling, screen time, Facebook, whatever it is. I think now in the DSM, social media addiction might even be in there, I heard. So the condition of addiction in the modern world, why is it increasing so severely?
I don't know. If I had to guess, I would say it again has to do with our being so disconnected from nature and the natural world and natural rhythms of living. I think that makes us more and more vulnerable.
Integrative mental health conference, of which psychedelics plays a part, and what the new science of psychedelics means for mental health. What does the new science of psychedelics mean for mental health?
Well, first of all, the reason that we need a new science of mental health is that the current paradigm in psychiatry and in medicine in general is the biomedical model that states that all emotional mental events are products of brain biochemistry, and that the arrows of cause and effect flow one way from brain. Why can't they go the other way as well? Why can't disordered thinking produce disordered brain biochemistry? But that model is so dominant that the field of psychiatry now has become really nothing more than dispensing medications. And we really have no idea what these psychiatric medications do, especially the developing brain. I think we're doing a huge experiment with our kids who are often on multiple psychiatric drugs. We have no idea what the long-term effects of those are. And I think also the efficacy of these antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs is very questionable, and their safety is, I think, of great concern. So I think that we need a new science of mental health that is really based in a much broader, I would say, biopsychosocial spiritual model. And that opens up the possibilities of many more ways of influencing mental and emotional health through dietary, through physical activity, through use of natural substances. And I would certainly put psychedelic therapy and psychedelic experience in among those possibilities. So, we have some presentations at this conference on ibogaine, on psilocybin, on MDMA therapy, on ketamine, and we'll have a public discussion of that as well as along with the professional discussion.
And the attachment to pharmacology and, prescription medications within the field of mental health, like you just were talking about that, is that an effect of, I guess, the increase or the success, or somewhat success anyway, of innovation within the field of pharmacology, or is it a result of the influence of what the conspiracy theorists love to call big pharma? Where does industry play a role in this? And did it affect the entire practice of mental health treatment?
In a word, yes. I think there has been a very unsavory collusion of pharmaceutical companies, medical journals, and insurance companies to produce a really intense marketing campaign that has led to this widespread overuse of psychiatric medication. If you look at antidepressants, for example, I think that that collaboration of those interests has been very successful in convincing people that ordinary states of sadness are matters of imbalances of brain biochemistry that have to be corrected by taking medication. And, that has affected the prescribing habits of physicians, the demands of patients, and that coupled with the fact in our training of mental health professionals and doctors in general, we don't teach them other ways of managing these conditions. That's what I have been trying to correct through the University of Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine. We have, very intensive trainings for medical professionals, including psychiatrists, that look at all the things left out of conventional training, such as nutrition and mind-body interactions and botanical medicine and so forth.
And it just seems so obvious and intuitive to me that the omission of things like nutrition into the treatment of these disorders being left out of the curriculum with these medical professionals is just such a glaring omission. How could that possibly have happened?
How could that possibly be? I couldn't agree more. If you take nutrition, the total in 4 years at Harvard Medical School was 30 minutes, which were grudgingly allowed to a dietitian at one hospital to tell us about special diets we could order for patients. That has not changed a whole lot since I've been out of medical school. And when nutrition is taught, it's taught as biochemistry, and it's forgotten as soon as the biochemistry exams are over. So, I think most medical professionals are functionally illiterate in nutrition. It's not their fault. They weren't they weren't taught it. And there's many consequences of that. One is the abysmal food served in hospitals in this country. Another is the complete lack of attention to diet when you're dealing with a patient, and especially the influence of diet on mental and emotional health. There's now a tremendous amount of research going on the microbiome, the organisms we have in our gut, and how they influence the brain and mental and emotional health. And this is a whole new area that's just suddenly opened up.
And it does seem to me, at least, that like psychedelics, that nutrition and organic food, the source of our ingredients, what's shouldn't be in our food, healthy eating options, is making its way into the front and center of American consciousness. Like I just see, you walk in just to an average supermarket, not a Whole Foods or anything like that, and the organic section is, it's not hidden anymore. Is that true? Are we seeing an improvement?
But remember, you're in California.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
Yes, it is changing, and changing faster in some parts of the country than others. But there is still a remarkable absence of attention to all of this in the medical profession and in psychiatry, especially.
And finally, just to wrap it up, I want to backtrack a little bit, and you are talking about the education and just the general knowledge of medical professionals at large in the mental health field. What's it going to take for psychedelics to become, I guess, just part of the go-to, list of options for treating certain conditions within the medical community? Is it going to take, does it have to find its way into the universities and into the curriculum for it to be part of the practice? I mean, that just seems like it could take a whole generation.
Well, it is going to take more time, but I think what will probably most accelerate that is the appearance of more research data of the kind we've been seeing that documents the positive effects of these substances in ways that medical professionals can connect with. So the kind of research that's been done by Roland Fisher, and people at Johns Hopkins, at UCLA, the kind of research that MAPS has sponsored, I think that more than anything is going to make this change happen.
Well, I'm so happy to do this podcast with you, Dr. Weil. I know you've been on the front lines of mental health and psychedelic consciousness for decades now. It seems like you're going to live forever. Are you? Are you planning to?
I am not. I don't think I'd want that, but I'm doing okay.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure to talk to you.
You too.
Bye-bye.